Organizing this event today with the Inter-American Dialogue. You will hear from Peter Hakem shortly, who will be commenting on what should be some outstanding presentations, and George Washington University's Elliott School, and you'll be hearing from Nora Lustig shortly, who will actually be running this panel today. We're going to be talking about the Merida Initiative. As you know, this is an important discussion going on in the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship, but also with Central America, between the United States and Mexico and Central America. It's something that has aroused hopes that maybe there is momentum in the U.S.-Mexico relationship, that this could lead to a sense of co-responsibility on a number of issues regarding security, regarding primarily organized crime in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. It's also aroused a number of questions, of course, about the right strategy to go about this. What is the nature of the problem? What's the balance between civilian and military institutions? What is the U.S. responsibility? And Kristen Jackson's with us from the House Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. They held a hearing yesterday, some of you were at, looking at, what is the U.S. responsibility in this as well? And beyond the money that would be sent, or the actual equipment that would be sent, and training and so forth, what do we do on this side? And so there's a number of questions around this. Today is one opportunity among many over the next few months to have this conversation. We're very pleased to have with us an outstanding panel who Nora will introduce in a minute. And I also want to acknowledge a few other people in the room. Ambassador Andres Rosenthal over here, who's a member of our Mexico Institute Advisory Board and also a close associate of the Dialogue. And Mexico's former Deputy Foreign Minister. Maria Cheveste, I don't know if she's here yet, will probably be joining us, former Deputy Chief of Staff to President Clinton. Bernardo González Arechiga, who is over here as well. Good. He and Maria are both members of our Mexico Institute Advisory Board as well, and he is the director of EGAP, the Public Policy School at Monterrey Tech, as well as Ambassador Roberto Alvarez, who I saw walk in here somewhere, Ambassador of the Dominican Republic to the OAS, and I believe we may have the Ambassador of Guatemala and the Ambassador of Costa Rica joining us as well. Welcome to all of you, friends from here and from afar, and let me turn it over to Nora.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm delighted to be here and be the moderator of such a timely panel on the perspectives of the Merida Initiative and the future of U.S.-Mexico security cooperation. As Andrew said, we have a terrific panel, starting with John Bailey, who is a professor at Georgetown University and also the director of the Mexico Project, the Center for Latin American Studies there, who has been working on security issues for practically all his life, focused also on U.S.-Mexican relations in many dimensions, and his current projects include public security and police reform in the Americas and the relationship between crime, corruption, and democracy in Latin America. So you're right on target on this. The second presenter will be Jorge Chabat, who is a professor at the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económica, CIDE, in Mexico City, who is one of our leading experts on issues of narco-trafficking and national security. And among the many publications that he has co-edited a book with John Bailey called Transnational Crime and Public Security, Challenges to Mexico and the U.S. And our third speaker will be Alfredo Corchado, the Mexico Bureau Chief of the Dallas Morning News, who has been covering Latin America and Mexico throughout his career and has focused on issues of narco-trafficking and border violence quite succinctly. Alfredo has been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize at some point in his life, at least that's what your bio says. And you have received many awards, the most recent one being the 2007 Maria Morse Cabot Award. Then Peter Hakem, whom you all know, he's a local from the very, very, very local, who's the president of the Inter-American Dialogue, will offer some comments on the presentations. The presentations will be between 10 and 15 minutes each, about 10 minutes from Peter, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. So, John, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Nora. What I want to do is offer some opinions and impressions and say some things about Mexico and the public security crisis and some things about the Merida Initiative and focus more on the U.S. response, and if I have some time, say some things about Mexico as well. First, with regard to Mexico and the nature of the public security crisis, I've always been interested in the way in which organized crime relates to government. And there are basically, in my thinking, three ways that that kind of crime virtually in any government. And that's evasion, corruption, and confrontation. There are three kinds of ways of interacting. the ideal, of course, is evasion, and then the second best, I suppose, is corruption, and then the least probably favorable is confrontation. The Mexican pattern under the PRI for many years was mostly corruption, and there were ways of working out dealings with varieties of different types of organized crime, and that held up reasonably well into the 1980s, I think, when the drug trafficking became so significant in the region that really the primary mode of operation between government and the criminal groups was through corruption. And confrontation would operate on the margins to make adjustments and problems that might come up either within groups or between the groups and the police. The pattern which really becomes important in the early part of this century, 03, 04 perhaps, is the shift from corruption to confrontation. And I'm not sure exactly why these things happen. We have theories and hypotheses, I suppose, but maybe in 03, 04 the pattern began to shift pretty clearly toward confrontation, first amongst the gangs, and then in 06 and 07 amongst the gangs and between the gangs and the government. And Jorge's written a lot about this and probably would take us farther into that. But the confrontations became political as well, and it became in a way reminiscent of mafia and Sicily and that sort of thing, where a number of messages were being sent between gangs and government. And so it became a kind of a difficult problem with decentralization and the growth of powers of governors and municipal and state police at the same time that the gangs became more complicated and conflicts were taking place in ways that we really I couldn't understand very well within the gangs and between them and government. I was in Monterey, I don't know, October, November, and trying to understand what was going on, and I described, I really don't understand, to somebody who really should have understood, and he said, yeah, you really understand, which is you don't really understand what's going on. Then there's been the spillover. This is something new into the United States across the border, which alarms, rightly so, alarms the Americans, and Alfredo knows a lot about this and can talk more about that as well. But we read news items frequently about problems of these kinds of issues spilling over. And, for example, the problems of kidnappings in Phoenix, which has become an issue in the last few weeks. So what I'm trying to say here about the nature of the public security crisis is that it's evolved. And the confrontations that are going on now have highly political overtones, and targets are being picked out who are prominent political people as opposed to inter-gang kinds of issues. Let me shift over to the Merida Initiative and focus really on the U.S. side, and to the extent I have any time, say something about Mexico as well. What's interesting, I think, about the Merida Initiative, the little bit that we know about it actually, is it takes place in the last year of Republican administration, and it will probably be supported by a Democratic Congress. This way, it sort of reminds us of NAFTA a little bit, no? That it's negotiated by a Republican administration. I think it'll have support in Democratic Congress, and then in the next administration, we don't know. I mean, if Republican or Democrat, but there will be a transition, and I assume that the initiative, as it picks up, will begin as a kind of a collection of programs I'll talk about in a second, but it may evolve into something more interesting in the next administration. It may actually resemble something that looks like a plan or a strategy as opposed to what it looks like now. But my impression is President Bush was very much impressed with his visit to the region in March and persuaded that the problems were evolving in a way that was very menacing, and pledged the support of the U.S. government to the extent that it could to try to be helpful in dealing with these problems of public security. And I think also the border, I was talking earlier with our colleague from the Mexican embassy, I think the border members, Reyes and Cuellar and so forth, were really very concerned about developments along the border and got behind the initiative and tried to be helpful to it. So we have an initiative by the administration, which I think will have strong support by the Democrats, even though there are issues that they're raising about how the initiative was negotiated. Let me say some things about what I think the U.S. response looks like. I think the response is, and the reason I'm saying this is because I don't know that much about it, only what I've been able to glean out of some congressional hearings and read in the news. The U.S. response is basically do more of what we're doing, add some things, and try to do them better. And what I'm understanding from what I'm reading so far, it really, the Merida Initiative on the U.S. side is bureaucratic negotiations amongst equals. It doesn't seem to be a strong leader, as far as I can tell, that's really taking a hold of the project and making a kind of a strategy or trying to make a kind of a plan out of it. The report from Senator Lugar's office was helpful. I think what I got from that report was it's a very long list of ambitious spending items, most of which are sensible. But I don't see anything that's really marginal or really not very helpful. These are sensible initiatives, and there's an effort to put a good deal of money behind them. Yesterday's hearings with Congressman Ingle was really about one of the important issues about weapons trafficking. And what I gleaned from that was it was a collection of leading agencies, state, Homeland Security, DEA, FBI, ATF, CPB, that's Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And what I got from it was each of the agencies was trying to make its best case. This is what we're doing. We're trying to do it well. Each of the agencies has something that it's doing, and they're trying to think of ways to better integrate themselves and cooperate. But there's really, from my reading of it, there's really not a guiding hand behind this. It's a conversation amongst equals. And in a way, it sort of makes sense because each of these agencies has its own congressional support. Each of them has its own history and constituency and so forth. So they're gathering together to try to be helpful as best they can and to try to integrate and cooperate as best they can as well. The three sort of impressions that I got from reading it is the conversation is border-centric, which I suppose makes sense because these are agencies that deal with U.S. Security and that they're primarily oriented toward the border. But if we contrast it with the Canadian side and the cooperation that the Americans have with the Canadians, it's really rather striking. The Americans and the Canadians cooperate much more with joint operations and intelligence sharing and that sort of thing. And what I got from this conversation is the Mexicans tend to be a little border-centric, and in this conversation yesterday, the Americans were border-centric as well. Also, the conversation is drug-centric, and that makes sense too, as far as I can see, because it's a way to address an important problem in the United States, which is drug abuse, and also to generate political support. Because if the effort is to get Congress focused and willing to support an ambitious initiative, one way is to tie it to drugs. And so in the conversation yesterday, the metric that we see most is price and quality of drugs availability on the streets and the benefits of this Merida Initiative with respect to disrupting drug trafficking. And that is legitimate as far as it goes, but it introduces a kind of a complication, I think. Also, it's future-oriented. So I would say it's border-centric, drug-centric, and future-oriented in the sense that the conversation is things we hope to do in the future or things we're doing now and hope are going well and we want to do more of in the future and do them better. And what I'm trying to say there is there's not a very impressive effort to demonstrate the effectiveness of the kinds of programs that are underway, but there is a commitment to do these programs and to do them better in the future. And I think Government Accountability Office and different kinds of policy evaluation are going to be critical down the road to see to what extent there can be some improvements on that. Policy learning. This is another thing that I think is really very important. I think the Americans have learned a lot, and most of it positive. In the conversation that we've had so far, the Americans are very aware of the balloon effect. They're aware of it, and they're aware if there's success with regard to disrupting trafficking out of Central America and Mexico, it'll go somewhere. But people don't seem to think where it's going to go or what's going to happen, and I'm not aware of a conversation about what are the likely repercussions for the Caribbean or for other parts of the world if there is a balloon effect. The Americans are very concerned about human rights, and genuinely so. This is not, I think it's not rhetoric. They're really worried about the effects of an anti-crime program with respect to human rights abuses, and one way it takes is the concern about the Army and the involvement of the Army more intensively in policing. The Americans are genuinely concerned about reducing drug consumption in the United States. This is, I think, is not rhetoric either. And there is an effort to put resources toward that and to deal with it. The Americans are very concerned about arms trafficking. And that was the basis. The point of the hearing yesterday was about trying to find ways to disrupt and deal with arms. The Americans are also, there's a subtlety here that the Americans are aware of, which pleasantly surprised me, which is anti-crime programs have tremendously important political effects, and they usually have political effects against social movements. And it's a kind of a subtle issue, but to the extent that there's anti-crime initiatives, they can carry over into what seem to be anti-labor, anti-peasant, anti-marginal kinds of efforts as well, and that can have important political complications. Let me just close by saying there's kind of a confusion about the goals, but I think it's not a very serious confusion. The Americans list a series of goals that they want to try to pursue. One is, of course, the anti-drug part. Another is anti-terrorism. A third is sort of pro-justice reform and the support for public security improvements in Mexico and in the region more generally. Different goals come in with different priorities. Mostly it's about drugs, but it can also be a little bit about anti-terrorism. It can also be a little bit about pro-justice reform. And the reason that I mention this right now is that at this stage of the initiative, it makes sense to have vague goals that one is going after to sort of increase your constituency and your support. But then these goals have to get themselves sorted out as the programs are actually developed and implemented. And that's something that we'll see in the course of the coming months. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Now it's Jorge's turn.
Okay, thank you. Well, sorry for the computer, but I have prepared my presentation in PowerPoint. I think in PowerPoint, so it's coming.
Do we have
Well,
PowerPoint?
yeah, it's here. But I just going to help me with my computer. Well, first of all, thanks to the organizers of this event. It's a pleasure for me at the Woodrow Center. Thanks to Andrew for the invitation. I'm glad that I'm in such a good company. Every conference I go, I find Andres Rosenthal there and say, why has not come yet, Rosenthal? So I saw him last week in London. So well, it's like a family here. So and I'm so glad of being out with the rest of the panel, especially Professor Bailey. I was in a conference with him too 1 month ago. So well, okay. So to talk about the Merida Initiative before I deal with that issue, I just want to mention some brief background to understand where we are now and what can follow in the future. I will have to say that, well, first of all, we have had an historical lack of trust in Mexican police forces coming from the U.S. We have had some conflicts related to the lack of trust and corruption in Mexican police forces. I don't want to mention all of them, but you must remember the Camarena affair, the Gutierrez Rebollo scandal, this guy who was fired as the drug czar in Mexico in 1998, the Operation Casablanca. I mean, it has been a big problem. That's why the Merida Initiative is so important, because it seems that for the first time in many years, this pattern of distrust, of mistrust is being changed. Also, as a background of the Merida Initiative, I will have to mention that we, as John mentioned also, we have seen a war between drug cartels from 2005 to 2007 with high levels of violence, which have not been present in Mexico. I mean, it doesn't mean that drug trafficking does not generate violence. Obviously, it generates violence, but there is a functional level of violence, the violence that drug trafficking needs to work as a business. What we have seen in 2005, 2006, a part of 2007 is another thing. It's a war between two cartels, and obviously drug trafficking violence is a war. Drug trafficking is against drug traffickers. It has provoked also another conflict, but this conflict has not been provoked by corruption or lack of trust. This conflict between U.S. and Mexico has been provoked by these high levels of violence. And also I will have to mention that at the beginning of 2007, there were some versions, and it seems that it was in the mind of the decision makers in the U.S., the idea of creating a kind of regional framework between Central America, Mexico, and the U.S. in order to deal with some threats coming from that area, drug trafficking coming from South America, passing through Central America, and other problems, other threats like maras, organized crime, human smuggling, this kind of thing. Actually, the first time that the war planned Mexico, I know that I don't have to mention that war, but it's just to make reference to the discussion. It has been Plan Mexico has been used to name this kind of efforts that finally arrived into the Merida Initiative that can at some point be the basis for some regional security framework. Well, what happened in the Calderon administration? When Calderon arrived to office, he inherited some problems from the previous administration. Basically, parts of the territory of the Mexican territory were controlled by drug traffickers, something that didn't happen in the past. There were really high levels of drug-related violence. At the same time, there was some kind of practice during the Fox administration, and that was the reluctance to use the public force. I mean, Fox, for some reasons that maybe a psychologist can explain better than me, didn't want to use public force for anything. Maybe the Tlatelolco syndrome, he didn't want to pass to the history like Díaz Ordaz or whatever. But that was also a characteristic of the Mexican government. And as I have mentioned, there were some friction with the U.S. government because of drug-related violence in the border, in the U.S.-Mexico border, and Calderon had to deal with that. What was the Calderon's strategy to deal with these problems? Well, basically, he decided to put all his interest and energy in the security issue. One, because it was a serious problem and was a very important concern of the Mexican population. Second, because it was a very good bet in political terms. I mean, if you fight some social groups, well, some can accuse you or you are using repression against social movements. Who can defend drug traffickers? Nobody. You cannot say they are social fighters or this kind of stuff. So it was a very useful political tool, and it worked to give Calderon the support of the population during the first month of his administration. His popularity has increased in an important way. And this strategy was based on some points. One of them was the police military operations that took place at the end of 2006 and the beginning of 2007 in some states of Mexico. At the same time, he sent in March a proposal for security reforms that are being discussed right now in the Congress. In principle, there is an agreement, and it has not been voted. This reform has not been voted yet, but it includes some giving more faculties to the Mexican police, and also a very important judicial reform, moving the judicial system to oral trials. Another point of this strategy was the extradition of drug traffickers to the United States, which was very useful for Calderon because of two reasons. One of them, it helped to improve the relationship with the United States in a significant way, and at the same time, it helped the Calderon administration to get rid of some hot potatoes. I mean, complicated drug traffickers that were acting from Mexican jails. The third point of this strategy was the improvement of the Mexican army and police capabilities, and in that point, that's where the Merida Initiative fits. I mean, basically, Calderon said, well, we need more resources, more technology, and it seems that he suggested that to President Bush in the visit of Bush to Mexico in March 2007 in Merida Initiative, and that's why it's called the Merida Initiative, because the meeting was in Merida. And finally, I would say that during the last month or so, there has been another. There is another point in this strategy, and it has been the offensive against the structure of the drug trafficking cartels. What we saw in the past was the arrest of the big capos. That's what we saw during the Fox administration. Now we are seeing an attack to the gunmen, to the structure, the capture of some of these sicarios. Okay, chirurgical strikes, what suggests that there is an increase in the use of intelligence. Well, you know what the Merida Initiative is. The Merida Initiative is, I'm not going to mention that, so I go to the final slide. Well, what are the challenges that this initiative has? Well, the approval in the U.S. Congress, it can be politicized. A rejection of this initiative could damage Calderon's legitimacy in an important way. Also, this initiative is facing and will face the approval of Mexican political elite, even when it seems that it's not necessary to go through a congressional process, but at least some part of the political elite will reject that because you know the arguments, no? Imperialism and intervention and all that stuff. Also, the acceptance of the U.S. and Mexican public opinion. There are still some sectors here and there that don't like this initiative for many different reasons. Problems of corruption in Mexican security force. I mean, there are some scandals of corruption. Well, the initiative will just fail. And also some exaggerate demands to Mexico or exaggerate expectations on what the Merida Initiative can do. There are some rumors that the U.S. government is thinking, asking for more extraditions to the U.S. In exchange for the Merida Initiative support. More arrests, maybe, or maybe the U.S. can expect the eradication of violence, which is obviously impossible at 100%, or the big reductions in the flow of drugs, or even the disappearance of drug trafficking. That's not going to happen. I mean, if somebody expects that the Merida Initiative is going to end drug trafficking, no way. Also, there can be unintended consequences like the increase of violence or the balloon effect, as John has mentioned. Well, what are the perspective for this initiative in the following months? Well, I think that the recent actions of Calderon, the last part of the strategy against drug trafficking, this arrest of this gunman, should facilitate the approval in the U.S. Congress. I hope so. However, it is possible to expect some opposition in the United States and Mexico. And also, we have to have in mind that the success in fighting drugs in Mexico will depend on many factors, not only the Merida Initiative. Legal reforms in Mexico, control of corruption, Mexican intelligence capabilities. And my impression is that if this initiative is successful and some of these efforts developed by Calderon are successful, what we will see in the following years, and that's my guess that this is the goal of the Calderon strategy, is an atomization of, pulverization of the big drug cartels. If that works, we will have drug trafficking coming from Mexico, but we will have these big cartels with these higher levels of violence, something like what happened in Colombia. Well, Colombia has another problem, but in terms of drug trafficking, nobody talks about the Colombian cartels, and Colombia is producing more cocaine than ever now. No? So this is not the solution of the problem of drug trafficking, but maybe it's a new way to have the same problem with the different manifestations like violence. And I will end saying also, but maybe also the Merida Initiative could be the basis for a new regional security framework between Mexico, Central America, and the United States. And that's it. I stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Jorge. Alfredo.
Thank you. I also want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center, Andrew, Kate, and Diane for the invitation and the support. And I'm going to try not to talk too much about the Merida Initiative or give my opinions about the initiative. As reporters, we were paid not to do that. Instead, I'll try to kind of give you more of a first-hand view on the situation along the U.S.-Mexico border. And I have to say that it's gratifying to see so many people here, because sometimes when you're on the border, it's kind of a lonely world, and you wonder, does anybody even care? Is anybody even reading this? I'd like to spend my 10, 15 minutes or so speaking about the current threats to one of the fundamental rights of any democracy, and that's the freedom of expression. As you may know, January was the bloodiest month in Mexico. More than 200 people were killed. Just in the last week or so, dozens more have been gunned down, and nearly 5,000 in the last 2 years. Among the dead this week, Francisco Ortiz Monroy, killed Tuesday in Camargo, Tamaulipas. He's the first journalist murdered this year and the 36th in the last 7 years, according to Mexico's Human Rights Commission. I'll start by giving you a quick background of how I became intrigued by the issue of drug trafficking. There's an old adage in journalism, and that's you follow the money. In my case, it was follow the bloodshed, or follow the bodies, which eventually led me to Nuevo Laredo, Ciudad Juárez, and to these days to report on the biggest threat to Mexican democracy. Just a few years ago, I was a Washington correspondent covering U.S. policy to Latin America. In 2003, I returned to Mexico and immediately began covering the story of why so many women in Juárez were being killed. It's the kind of story that quickly scars you for life. You have mothers who trust that you will find answers for them, answers that have eluded them for so many years. I got to know so many shady characters, from cops, reporters, or so-called reporters, to sources who disappeared from one day to the next. And worse, I've had sources killed, including one who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life because he helped smuggle me across the border in his car trunk and into the United States. It's the kind of story that consumes you at all times. It's funny, but just a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting with Pepe Carreño, who a friend of mine and a friend to many of you here, and it was one of those spring January mornings in Colonia Condesa, and I was telling you how much I miss Mexico City and how much I miss being at the Parque Mexico, because I've been gone most of the last 4 years. And it was so disappointing because all I could hear Pepe say was how much he missed D.C. and the cold weather here. And then I picked up Reforma and Universal, and there was a big headline that said El cartel en el DF, the Mexican cartel in Mexico City. And I said, Pepe, vamos a hacer cuates de taberna, because I think I'm going to stay here for a while now. And sure enough, the celebration lasted maybe a day or two, because the next day the news was that Juárez was again breaking a new record, the most kills since 1997, which has been the last two cities I visited this week, Nuevo Laredo and Ciudad Juárez. But an interesting thing happened in those 2 days in Mexico City, as I reported in San Ángel, Coyoacán, and Pedregal, where federal authorities had discovered an arsenal of weapons and hitmen planning to kill a high-level official. Suddenly I felt deja vu, because just like residents on the border, these people were also afraid to talk or to give out their names. And they were worried about how much worse the situation can get if President Calderon's strategy doesn't work. Many feel Mexico has reached a point of no return, that the long coexistence between government and cartels appears, and I stress the word appears, to be over. So in my talk, I like to zero in on the story of what I call the death of a town, the silencing of one of the most important border communities in Mexico, Nuevo Laredo, just across Laredo, Texas. It's a story of how traffickers systematically took over a community by co-opting cops, the mayor, the mayor's office, reporters, and along the way kill freedom of expression. And I will do so, and I hope you can appreciate, because I'm told that this is being taped and it's live on the internet, right? I hope you appreciate that I won't name sources. I will tell you that the sources include former federal policemen, local Nuevo Laredo cops, Mexican journalists, U.S. and Mexican intelligence sources, and a spokesperson for the Zetas, because, yes, they do have a spokesperson, and informants for the Sinaloa and the Gulf Cartel. I believe the story is important because the lessons of Nuevo Laredo and other border communities offers Chilangolandia and many other major Mexican cities plenty of lessons on how badly things can get. Nuevo Laredo is a city of more than 300,000 people across Laredo, Texas. The region is also home to Interstate 35. The corridor accounts for more than 60% of all legal and illegal trade, dope and coke included, between Mexico and the United States. Historically, the area has been highly coveted by drug traffickers, including Los Chachos and Los Tejas. The two drug gangs often fought each other for terrain, but largely respected each other's territory. They also somehow coexisted with the local government, the state and federal police, the media, and the public in general. As one former federal policeman told me recently, we all shared a piece of the pie. In the 1990s, the situation took a turn for the worse. That's when Mexico began using elite special forces known as GAFES, 4,000 or so of them who were trained by the United States government to take on well-armed drug traffickers. But Osiel Cárdenas, who at the time was the head of the GAF cartel, had other ideas. He met with members of the GAFES and said, "Desert and we'll triple your pay, plus offer you other goodies." 35 members took up the offer. Some of the GAFES became Zetitas, or Zetas, the paramilitary armed forces of the GAF cartel. In their first real battle in August of 2003, right in downtown Nuevo Laredo, they introduced bazookas, 50 caliber machine guns, and grenades. Right in the and the border town has never been the same. In an email to a Mexican journalist colleague of mine, an alleged Zeta explained his motives in the following way, and he said, and I'm quoting, "I belong to the Army, specifically to the Special Forces Unit. Now I'm on the other side of the law. I was loyal to my unit, and I risked my life an infinite number of times in situations that I now understand were not worth risking. And then I understood that you cannot live out of loyalties. While our commanders were eating meat, we, with the sweat of our foreheads, were only able to eat beans. Today, some of those Zetas have been killed, others jailed, but the recruiting efforts continue, having lured more military top elite members to their side. Between 1998 and 2001, according to an EFI report, more than 1,300 elite GAFE members defected the Mexican Army. Many of them went to work for the drug traffickers. And a confidential military report that we just obtained through EFI, or the FOIA, that was known as FOIA here in the United States, shows that at least 300 Zetas operate throughout Mexico with hundreds, if not thousands, more working as a support system. They've also established training camps in at least 5 states, Michoacán, Tamaulipas, Veracruz, Hidalgo, and Nuevo León. Some are known as Zetitas. Others include Maras, who, by the way, do not generate much trust because they're not very disciplined and are easily addicted to dope. Others are paramilitary members from Guatemala known as Caiviles. They've also hired Texans as young as 13 to kill on the Mexican side and then hightail it back to the U.S. side, knowing if they're caught, they'll be treated as minors. An estimated 40% of their earnings are used to bribe and co-opt cops, the military, and even the press to control information. Nuevo Laredo today, in spite of the recent presence of the military, remains under full control of the Zetas through an intricate web of spies, checkpoints, and skillful use of technology. They've also recruited hundreds of so-called falcones, or lookouts, whose job is to report anything unusual in both Nuevo Laredo and Laredo. The falcones range in profession from waiters to shoeshine boys to cab drivers, bellboys, and local hotels, including, there's a very nice photographer when you arrive in Nuevo Laredo who takes your photograph. But my sources have told me that he also works for the Zetas. Depending on the value of the information, the pay ranges from about $100 a week to $500. In Laredo, authorities know of at least 5 sleeper cells with gunmen making $500 a week just to sit around and await orders to kill. They've also set up electronic eavesdropping of select agencies and businesses. That's why more than half of all cell users in Nuevo Laredo and Laredo prefer Radio Nextel phones for security reasons. At City Hall, they've also installed loyal members to serve as bodyguards, keeping a watchful eye on the mayor. A once fledgling civic movement aimed at restoring peace in Nuevo Laredo ended tragically. Citizens had planned a giant rally in downtown. The activities included making white bumper stickers featuring a dove that were plastered on vehicles on both sides of the border. Then the mysterious calls began, warning the organizers to cancel the rally. Those calls were ignored, and on the day of the rally, a participant was shot in the head and killed. The peace movement, I think, also died that day. Since the extradition of Osiel Cárdenas to the United States in January of 2007, the Zetas have evolved into their own brand of mafia, Chicago style, and they've literally split from their employers, the GAF cartel. Meanwhile, hundreds of Nuevo Laredo residents have packed up and fled to Laredo. It was interesting being in Laredo this week because I was traveling through what they call Bullock Boulevard, and it's just like a new town that's being built there. City officials say that some of that growth is because of the people fleeing Nuevo Laredo. Mexican businessmen who have grown tired of paying monthly extortions to Zetas in order to stay in business now live and work in Laredo. It was funny. I was talking to one businessman who said, he's so homesick for his food in Tamaulipas, which is right across, but once, twice a week, he sends an employer to Nuevo Laredo to have his maid make food and then bring it back to Laredo. And the press has fared no better. Reporters have been silenced, others co-opted. The Zeta spokesperson, for instance, is a radio reporter, and on a daily basis calls editors and orders them what stories they're permitted to cover or not cover, and where the stories can play, if at all. The job of spokesperson can be dangerous too. 2 years ago, when cartel spokesman, radio reporter Guadalupe Escamilla asked for a pay raise, the golf cartel said no, and fearful that she will work for the competition, the Sinaloa cartel, pumped 17 bullets into her. The newspaper El Mañana, a family-owned company, has been the hardest hit. Since the fight for territory began, their editor, Roberto Mora, was stabbed to death. One of the owners was kidnapped, and in return for his release, the family agreed to never investigate organized crime again. The family, except for their strong-willed mother, now lives in Laredo, Texas. A year ago, El Mañana ran a photo that was not clear beforehand by the spokesperson, and the result, gunmen stormed into the building and bombed the building. They also shot up the place, and one of the reporters was hit and paralyzed. Today, reporters who have proven a bit hard-headed are routinely picked up and beaten with a paddle and warned to behave or else. Ironically, with the military in the state of Tamaulipas, including Nuevo Laredo, the Zetas are now financing their own civic groups to stage anti-military protests. They're very familiar that human rights is a big issue in the United States. The Zeta spokesperson calls on a daily basis and lobbies for these stories to run in the newspapers or air on TV and radio. One other time, a high-ranking Zeta, actually this anecdote may be a little too personal, so I'll skip that. Meanwhile, the media blackout is spreading. Mexican newspapers on the border completely ignore the narco story unless they're told otherwise, as in the case of a former mayor and federal congressman. The Zetas, it was interesting that last November there was a mayor kill and who was also a former federal congressman. That morning, the spokesperson called and alerted the reporters that there might be an important incident that day, and asked that the story be played significantly in the next day's paper. So, without exception, all the Tamaulipas newspapers had the story and the pictures of this mayor gunned down in Rio Bravo. Nationwide, some leading newspapers, including Reforma, no longer publish bylines on stories dealing with organized crime. Other reporters have relocated or quit the profession. And American reporters are not immune either. U.S. reporters and news directors now often seek volunteers to cover narco stories in Mexican border towns, especially Nuevo Laredo. Some cameramen have had their tapes taken. Others have been told to stay away or else. Other media outlets now completely ignore the story, victims of budget cuts. Ironically, one of the most credible threats that I received was not on the Mexican side, but at a bar in Laredo, Texas. But in the end, I'm lucky that I can parachute in and out of this region, unlike my Mexican colleagues who are based on the border. Finally, in interviewing residents this week, one thing was clear. All expressed support for the military, but they have one nagging question that I think many in Mexico and here are asking today. What happens after the military leaves? Because U.S. demand will not disappear, they say. And many express concern that while they feel safer with the presence of the military, they're all losing business in Nuevo Laredo, and they can't continue for very long. 2 months ago, I interviewed the new mayor of Nuevo Laredo, Ramon Garza. He had a simple message. He said, the worst is over. We want Texans to return, shop, dine, dance, spend dollars in Nuevo Laredo. The mayor even said he was in favor of the $1.4 billion Merida Initiative, as long as the package didn't include plans to create more elite military units in Mexico. He said good intentional plans often lead to unintended consequences. He also had a message for the Chilangos of Mexico City. There's no sovereignty without security, and added that he had sent us a message. I'm not your friend, but I'm also not your enemy. This week, I wanted to talk to the mayor again, but he never returned my call. Friends say that the mayor is under a lot of pressure by the Zetas to denounce the presence of the military. Meanwhile, the Zetas and the Golf Cartel, I'm told, have developed a plan to create their own newspaper in the state of Tamaulipas and sway public opinion their way. So stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Peter, now it's your turn to comment.
Wait.
Put all of this in perspective.
What can one say? Pretty discouraging. Let me start off by saying it's always a pleasure to work with Andrew and with Nora. I want to be brief, and so I'll be somewhat random in my comments. I want to be brief so we do have some time for conversation. Let me say from the outset, I think that in many respects it's sort of obvious that the U.S. ought to go ahead with this kind of cooperative program, the Merida Initiative. Why? Because basically two countries that have a lot of common problems have reached agreement on how they ought to deal with them cooperatively. The concept is very, very clear that if we're going to really have any effort at cooperative security on the border, the two countries are going to have to work out that together. This is an instance they have worked it out together, and it seems pretty obvious that we ought to move ahead as a platform for continuing broader cooperation in this area. Let me also say that I think that if the U.S. and Mexico can't find a way to cooperate on this issue, which is so central to both countries, it seems hard to imagine that there's going to be cooperation on almost any issue. I mean, this is, two countries. I don't have to tell this audience how integrated the U.S. and Mexico are. And, it struck me in a debate that we had at the Dialogue on this initiative, after debates about NAFTA, debates about immigration policy. In other words, now the U.S.-Mexican relationship hinges on such a sort of actually small initiative, but that's so obvious, and yet it's sort of still being debated. Let me go on. I am afraid, though, that this initiative doesn't represent anything like overcoming the historic lack of trust. I think that remains. This is a response not to greater trust, but to greater urgency. I think that that's what we've heard before. And it also responds to sort of the lack of other initiatives between the two countries, and the fact that President Calderon still hasn't visited Washington is very indicative, in that he will make a first trip, I think, very soon, this week, right? And will not come to Washington. In any event, let me go on. Again, like I said, I'll be somewhat random. I don't think that there's certainty that Congress is going to approve this, as John seems to have suggested. I find it very, very hard to read the discussion in Congress right now. Talking with members and with staff of Congress, they're really, nobody's against the concept that I suggested. Everyone says, yes, the concept is terrific. And then they begin to get into the details, and you begin to sort of say, well, is this ever going to come together? Frankly, I don't think they know if it's going to pass or not. I think there is just confusion. And it's, of course, during an election year, so electoral politics plays a very heavy role. Events in Mexico on the border will the events that involve Mexican immigrants are going to all have an important impact on how this is debated and discussed. Let me say that the big danger I see right now is that in the U.S. Congress, there's a tendency to treat this not as a cooperative initiative reached by debate and discussion between two sovereign countries, but this is a U.S. program. And that there's a lot of discussion, how is it going to be monitored? How is it? And when they talk about monitoring, it's not only monitoring the $1.5 billion in equipment, training, etc., that the U.S. is providing, but it's monitoring, the $7.5 billion that Mexico is putting in. So when we talk about monitoring, and then again, they ask about what metrics, I think I heard, are going to be used to measure this. And they're talking about the whole initiative, not the 1.5. And, it's hard not when they begin to talk about metrics to begin to hear residents of Plan Colombia. And what was the success of Plan Colombia, if you had a metric? It was to strengthen the power of the state, to strengthen the Colombian military, to increase the authority of democratic authorities throughout the country. And what was the failure? Basically doing anything about drugs. And so if this is an anti-drug program and that becomes a metric, it's going to be a very confusing debate, because I think that most people in Congress now recognize that our anti-drug effort does very, very little that affects the actual flow of drugs, that it's more generated by installed bureaucracies and local politics than it is by any serious expectation that it's going to seriously deal with the drug issue. And Plan Colombia is the perfect idea. We continue to put in lots of money, despite every evaluation is that it's had almost no impact on the flow of drugs to the United States. Let me just say that there's also sort of some buzzing around. No one really wants to use the word conditionality, but one hears that human rights conditions, that Mexico and frankly, I hope that this doesn't get into the debate, but it's very easy. Once it's in a bill, once it's in an amendment, it's hard for U.S. congressmen to vote against something that says Mexico has to meet certain human rights conditions. It's just very hard to get it out. How can anybody be against human rights? And that has all kinds of connections. Let me just end up with a comment. That the two major initiatives of the Bush administration in this final year are two initiatives with its closest allies. One is the Merida Initiative, closest partners, let's say, not allies, maybe a too strong a word. But certainly with the Merida Initiative with Mexico and the free trade agreement with Colombia. And it's very possible that neither of them will get through. And that says a good deal. And, one can hardly criticize the Bush administration. It's pushing hard for both of them. It's the sort of U.S. politics, the lack of urgency for dealing with important issues in Latin America. It's the attention to other issues, etc. And it's going to be very hard for any new president to do much better. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Well, listening to the implications of the Plan Colombia and the perspectives in terms of controlling narco trafficking being so low, maybe it doesn't matter if it doesn't pass. I think that one has to think about that. Now we're going to open the floor for questions and answers, and I would like to invite everybody to identify themselves before you speak. And we're going to give the first question, if you don't mind, to Ambassador Rosenthal in honor of his presence here. And so Andres The floor is yours.
Nice talk.
Gracias, Nora. Thank you. I'm not going to ask a question. I'm going to make a comment as well, short comments. Because I think it's important that in discussing the Merida Initiative, and all of the panelists have approached it from different perspectives. The one perspective that has not come out is what I would call the Mexican perspective. That is the Mexican way in which people are looking at this issue on the other side of the border. And I think what Peter says is quite true. On the U.S. side, at least in the officialdom of the United States in Congress and so on, this is seen as a U.S.-inspired, U.S.-born initiative. And on the Mexican side, the government has been very clear to present this as a Mexican initiative presented to the United States at the Merida meeting to, more than anything else, symbolically involve the United States in its shared responsibility for the drug problem. Our shared responsibility, which, if you look at the historical evolution of this issue, is quite recently, something quite recently accepted by the United States government. Generally, this has been something on which blame has been placed everywhere else, other than in the United States. And I think that the symbolic importance of this Merida Initiative is fundamentally to show that the United States is part of the problem and therefore needs to be part of the solution. It is also symbolic in the sense that the financial impact, although useful, is a drop in the bucket in terms of the amounts that would be needed eventually to be able to conduct this quote-unquote war on organized crime and drug trafficking. I think there's also a feeling in Mexico that this is in some way or other meant to balance and counteract the border security initiatives that have been coming out of the United States Congress and the U.S. administration to build walls and to put up all sorts of obstacles and so on, something which obviously is seen from the Mexican perspective as anything less than, something much less than allies or even partners. Mm-hmm. It is a very aggressive and very anti-Mexican thing as seen from the Mexican perspective. Yes, it will help Mexico's technical capacity, if you like, by adding equipment and training, but it is not the real main issue. And if you add to this the probable Mexico bashing that will take place when this becomes a debating issue in the U.S. Congress sometime later this year, on the human rights issues, on immigration, on corruption, on arms trafficking, on border violence and insecurity, it is not surprising that the foreign minister has already put on the table that if the cost is seen as being too high on the Mexican side to get this thing through, Mexico will withdraw it. Mm-hmm. So I think this is an issue which is not really seen as much from the U.S. side, and as Peter very rightly says, the debate here is how are we going to control, how are we going to audit, how are we going to make sure the money doesn't get to people's pockets instead of going to where it needs to go, rather than as a real bilateral issue. The final comment I wanted to make relates to Calderón's popularity in Mexico and how long people are going to give him the benefit of the doubt on this particular issue. You'll recall that Calderón gave three basic fundamental programs for his administration. One was fighting violence and insecurity. The other one was job growth. And the third one was a major infrastructure drive to build up Mexico's infrastructure and make Mexico more competitive. This is one issue on which not only has there not been any visible progress in Mexico, but as Jorge has pointed out, and Alfredo very poignantly, it has led to an enormous increase in violence and in killings and in insecurity. Now, it's all very fine and good for people on this side to say, and President Bush called Calderon the other day to congratulate him on all of the progress that's being made. And it's all well and good to say that the war is being won because people are getting killed, and that is an indication of winning a war. On the Mexican side, of course, that doesn't fly. On the Mexican side, people are not willing to accept that there's that type of a cost, even though the president has said that there will be a cost and that it will cost lives and money and so on. So the Merida Initiative as such, on the Mexican side, is also seen with some suspicion that there's a hidden agenda, shades of Plan Colombia, of the fact that there may be military presences in the whole thing, whether there's going to be some sort of an involvement on issues of sovereignty and so on and so forth. And I think Peter is right. I would not make it a foregone conclusion that the Merida Initiative is going to be something that is going to go forward, both because of the issues that he raised in the U.S., but also on the Mexican side, because if the cost is too high in terms of the relationship between Mexico and the United States and public opinion, then it is very possible that the Calderon administration itself might backtrack and say, you know, we don't, for $1.5 billion, it's not worth it.
Thank you, Andres. Yes, over here. You remember to identify yourself, please.
Ron Seckinger, Department of Homeland Security. I perceive a consensus among the panelists that nothing's going to stop the flow of drugs in the United States, or that it will not be markedly affected no matter what the program is. What I'd like to ask is whether there's a bilateral program through the Merida Initiative to tackle this together, or whether the Mexican government goes it alone. What would success look like in fighting organized crime? Say 2 or 3 years down the road, drugs are still coming in at the same level in the United States, but what would constitute success from a Mexican point of view?
I'm going to take a few questions unless
So
there's
a
no.
metric for success.
Yes, over here.
I'm Ralph Getz of the Association of OAS Retirees. You know, I'd like to add one sensitivity to Professor Bailey's list of sensitive things. This initiative, the Merida Initiative, doesn't have a Chinaman's chance of succeeding unless and until it's embedded in a comprehensive Mexican bilateral and multilateral economic and social development program. I'm not alone in saying this. Ambassador Thomas Stanton, a few days ago at the Foreign Press Center, said that strongly advocated programs of community development. You can cure cancer not only by using radiation, but sometimes a radical change of diet is what is necessary. And the diet, in the case of the Merida Initiative, is a developmental dimension.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Anybody else? Yes.
I'm Ted Wilkinson. I think one of the major Mexican concerns in the Merida Initiative has been the virtually unrestricted flow of arms, some heavy weapons, including heavy weapons, into Mexico. And John Bailey noted that in the hearing yesterday, all of the U.S. agencies wrung their hands and said that we have to do something about it, but he doesn't feel that there's a guiding light that is bringing the agencies together on what we can do. Is there something that the U.S. can do that doesn't run into the gun lobby in the U.S. that we can help to attenuate Mexican concerns on this issue?
So do you want to take these questions and then John, one was addressed to you. So
Sure. Start. Okay. They're very interesting. One is a metric for success on organized crime. That's really an interesting question. One of the areas Alfredo already mentioned, and that is the key issue of the problem of the municipal police. And in many areas, usually, at least in the press accounts, municipal police, when stories of problems of organized crime come up, are embedded in the organized crime as part of the problem. And so a metric might be to the extent to which there is progress on finding ways to reform and improve quality of municipal police. And that's the bulk of the police in Mexico. I don't have the numbers at hand, probably 300,000 police. If there's some progress with respect to dealing with municipal police, I think that's really important. Second area is the key problem of political cover and protection for crime. And that's dealt with, and this typically, I mean, not just Mexico, the U.S. and other countries as well. Usually where there's a strong problem of organized crime, there's political protection for it. And the protection can take many different forms. It could be elected officials, it could be all kinds of appointed officials, whatever. But to the extent that there's progress, usually through the intelligence side, in neutralizing political support, that would be hard to measure, but a very important metric for success. Third is the improvement of income tax administration, because and regulatory policy more generally. One of the areas that's really critically important is money laundering and assets. And to the extent that there are advances made with respect to real estate transfers and purchase of luxury goods, and all that's a very complicated kind of administrative improvement with respect to tax administration and banking. But for metrics, that might be those might be areas to look at to include in a list. And then the second question was about the gun trafficking, and that's a difficult issue because the ATF, my understanding of the resources that they have, and the complexity of the border and the number of opportunities for gun sales, there's a mismatch there. And so I don't know. I can't remember the number of ATF officials, but it's something like 110 or something for the border. And in the short term, I don't think it's probably not realistic to expect dramatic improvements. But to the extent that there are additional resources and then efforts to cooperate between the countries, there could be some a strategy somewhere to begin somewhere to put resources to make the point and do a demonstration. And then perhaps to build on that to affect the flow in other places. Short term, probably not much. Longer term, maybe something. But I'm the optimist here. So.
Jorge?
Yeah, very briefly. The point of measuring success is obviously a key point not only in anti-drugs policies, but in many other policies. I will ask. Well, how can you measure success in fighting terrorism? Well, the answer is very simple. There are some policies that should be measured not by what you have, but by what you don't have. How you say a policy is successful in fighting terrorism if you don't have terrorist attacks, if you don't have this and this. The same with drugs. I mean, if you don't have drug traffickers controlling Mexican territory, well, that's a success. If you don't have people killed in the streets every day, that's a success. That is not happening yet. Even though I will say that I know that the common perception is that violence has been growing and growing and growing during the last 2 years. That's not totally true. According to official and non-official figures, since May 2007, there is a slight decrease in executions. It doesn't mean that we don't have a problem. I just want to tell you that this idea that the violence is growing without any limit is not true. And there is a change in the kind of violence we are seeing now in January, a violence between drugs traffickers and the state. What we saw in the previous 2 years was a violence between drug traffickers and drug traffickers. No? But well, the point is that you can measure that by what you don't have. And from my point of view, the goal of all these strategies should be to transform drug trafficking from a national security problem in Mexico, which is right now, into a public security problem that can be dealt with by police like any other crime. Obviously, nobody's saying that homicides are going to disappear. No. That crime is going to disappear. No, but if you control that to certain levels, that does not affect the stability of the country. For me, that's a success. If you don't have a president that is a drug trafficker, that's a success. I mean, it's hard to say that, and I know that it's difficult to sell that politically because, politicians at least some of them like figures, and like charts and all that stuff. But that's what we can expect from this war. And just a very quick point to what Pierre Hakim said about the factor of trust in U.S.-Mexican relations. I mean, it's difficult to say that this is we are going back to total trust, but my point was that it was impossible. I mean, for me, it's very difficult to think in 1985, when Camarena was killed, that the U.S. government was going to give $1.4 billion to Mexico. No way. I mean, no way at all. And if you compare the level of cooperation right now with the levels of cooperation in 1985, 7, well, we made an improvement. And even when I accept that there is still some risk, and the risk is basically corruption. I mean, Mexico, that's the point. But I mean, I don't work for the government. I didn't come here to defend the government. But from my point of view, the fact that some of the last strikes have been chirurgical strikes in Mexico, I mean, the Mexican police going to one house in Mexico City, is because they have intelligence. And because at the same time they have been able to control corruption. These kind of strikes were impossible in the past because the drug traffickers have, informants, and that's corruption. If the Mexican government has been able to control, at least for now, I'm not saying that it's going forever, the leaking of this information, it means that there are some progress. I don't know if that's going to continue in the future, but I mean, my point is what we have now compared to what we had in the past, and there is a difference. I hope that we will see a better improvement in the future, but it's difficult to know. But the efforts that the Mexican government is doing right now to professionalize police forces are the most serious efforts I ever saw. It doesn't mean that they are going to be successful. I'm very skeptical about the power of corruption in Mexico, but it was just all what I wanted to point out. Okay, so I don't know if
I just want to say that I've been trying, and I say unsuccessfully until now, to try to convince pollsters either in Texas or Mexico to do a survey on cities like Nuevo Laredo and Ciudad Juarez to see whether residents are happier with the military, with the new strategy, or whether they're happier with a coexistence situation, like in the old days. And my sense, I mean, I was in Nuevo Laredo in November, and it was obvious that the Zetas had won. And there were a lot of people from Laredo who were planning to go back home to Nuevo Laredo and live. They seem, we're going back to the old days where people didn't really kill each other. The violence was minimal. Because they understand that as long as you have U.S. demand, things are not going to change. So I've always been curious about that. Will the polls show that they prefer coexistence as long as there's U.S. demand, or the military? Another thing it's always very obvious, like Ambassador Rosenthal was saying, a lot of Mexicans get really offended when they find out that $1.4 billion is less than the $2 billion that the United States is paying every week on the war on terror, and $2 billion a week in Iraq. So they get really offended by that. And it was this week in Laredo, Texas. Some of the local policemen were saying, you want to take on the terrorists, come to the border, because they're on both sides of the border. So, anyways.
Peter wanted to say something.
I just wanted a very quick comment on the issue of guns, which, it's pretty clear that a big share, if not almost all the guns used in Mexico along the border are coming from the United States. I think that's and one can only imagine the pressure the U.S. would be putting on Mexico if the flow of guns to border towns in the U.S. was coming the other way. Mm-hmm. And when you say the ATF has only so much manpower, well, the Border Patrol for illegal immigrants has been raised how many times in the past? I mean, if there was seriousness about it, something could be done. There's no question in my mind that the U.S. could do more. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, don't think that will eliminate the problem. Brazil gets none of its guns from the United States. And its gangs are well armed. It's drug traffickers, have heavy equipment. They're able to take on the Brazilian police. So the markets for guns worldwide are enormous. And I think that what would happen is it would cost the criminals in Mexico a little more. It would be like a tax on the, but they would get their guns.
Yes. Margaret.
It would be useful, I think, to hear perhaps from Jorge. Sorry, I'm Margaret Daly Hayes. It would be useful to hear from Jorge when he returns. Okay, you're back. And Andres, the Mexican side of, not of the Merida Initiative, but what programs is Mexico undertaking in order to deal with this common problem? And we've only very briefly mentioned this whole question of reforming and professionalizing the police, and Jorge expressed his skepticism and so forth. Several of us have heard Genaro Garcia Luna talk about the professionalization program and the notion of vetting 100,000 people a year, which folks that I talk to say is almost impossible, that we couldn't do that, and so forth. So how much in place are some of these programs now, and when can we expect return? And Andres, I'd like you commented about the justifiable Mexican ire at being monitored on the use of its own resources, but how will Mexico monitor the success of these programs? Thank you.
Over there, Dolia.
Yes, I'm Dolia Esteves, and I want to ask a question to Alfredo, which has to do with journalism and freedom of the press. You gave a very concerning picture of what's going on in Mexico and as well as in the border. And I wanted to ask you if you can tell us what is being done by either government, the Mexican government and the U.S. government, because I think there is more than enough evidence to show a very alarming situation with everything that has to do attacks on the press, physical attacks, as well as censorship. And there's just a sense that not much is being done. And I was wondering if you can tell us if something is being done and what can be done.
Okay, so shall we now thank Jorge and Andres and you, right? You were asked by Margaret.
Yeah. No, but, well, very good. No, well, I'm skeptical about fighting corruption in Mexico because I have lived there for many years. But no, let me tell you, from what I saw, I think this is a serious program of reform. I mean, it's difficult to know if it's going to work. I hope it works, but the plans include the creation of a new police academy has been created. A new generation of federal police forces. I mean, the new policemen will need to have a bachelor's, which is something that didn't happen in the past. They will have from the beginning a decent salary for a person who has finished a bachelor's in Mexico. They will have a plan for housing, and I mean, obviously they are trying to do the best they can under conditions we have in Mexico. It doesn't mean that we won't have corruption. Of course not. We will have corruption. That happens everywhere. But I insist one argument that shows that maybe this is start to working, and obviously it doesn't mean that we won't see any case of corruption, is that the Mexican government has been able to make these chirurgical strikes. It suggests that the leakage of information that we have in the past, we are not having it right now, at least for now. So that's an important signal. I'm optimistic that we in Mexico can have these strong institutions. I don't think that we have in our DNA the corruption there, and we will never be able to have a strong institution. No, I mean, many countries have had, including the United States, have had serious problems of corruption in the past, and many other countries were able to build institutions. Yeah, but well, it's not. I mean, the problem is how to break this vicious circle of corruption, and we're into that process. I'm optimistic, but obviously, as a social scientist or pretended social scientist, I have to be a little bit skeptical because, well, it has happened in the past many times. But no, I think that the efforts are serious. I mean, and there is a lot of money and political will, and I hope they are successful. And I hope that if these efforts are successful, we will see the comeback, we will see the army going back to the headquarters in the future. When, I don't know. I mean, I don't think will be very, very soon. Probably will take some years. President Calderon 2 days ago said in an interview with the High Commissioner of Human Rights that, well, this process is going to happen at some point. At least they are thinking in that. But yeah, I mean, if you don't have a decent police to replace the army, well, the army is going to be there for a long time, unfortunately. So I don't know if
Andres, you want to comment on Margaret's question?
Well, I think one of the problems with calling this a war, whether you call it a war here or you call it a war there or you call it a war bilaterally, is that wars have winners and losers at the end of the game. And I'm not sure that it's very easy to find who is going to win this war. I think it's easier to look at it from the point of view of Jorge's prism of relative optimism, which is that we know that the money that that organized crime and drug traffickers offer, and the testimony of the military desertions and the recruitment is very eloquent, will never be able to be matched by the state as long as the price of drugs is what it is. So the only thing you can do really is make life difficult or miserable for those who are engaged in this business, especially on the economic side, on the financial side, and hope that they go away and they go to greener pastures. I mean, that's what in effect happened in Colombia. Although there hasn't been a change in the shift of the movement of the drugs, what you eventually did see was that a lot of the Colombian mafias and groups moved away and went to Mexico or other places. And we're seeing this happening already in the Mexican side. These surgical strikes that Jorge talks about have, to some extent, aggravated the problem of the movement of drugs from Mexico to the United States by opening new routes. And you are now seeing movement of drugs from Latin America to Europe, and then back to the United States via Canada, which has an easier border to cross, although less than it used to be. So it's like the proverbial balloon. Wherever you tighten, you move the thing somewhere else. And immigration has been the same issue. You put up walls and obstacles and things, and people will go somewhere else to do it. How does Mexico monitor or judge, or how do Mexicans feel about this issue? Well, we have now a similar problem to the United States. In the past, Mexico was just a transit country. I mean, we were just victims, if you like, of the movement of all of this stuff. Today, Mexico is a consuming country, and although we don't consume as much as you do in this country, the fact is that we do now have a serious drug problem in Mexico with Mexicans, with young people who are consuming drugs. And as a result, there is somewhat of an ambivalent position in terms of how people look at this, depending on what part of the socioeconomic ladder you're at. There are some people who are obviously look at this as an issue that will never be resolved unless somebody legalizes the consumption of drugs, or at least allows people to kill themselves if that's what they want to do, as they do with other things, and that this is not the biggest of the threats that you have to individual health and individual well-being. But, you know, we all look at Colombia, we all look at the $6 billion that has been spent by the United States alone, not counting what the Colombians and others have spent there. And what do you have as a result? Well, drug trafficking is still there, the cultivation is still there, the guerrillas still control most of the drug cultivation and trafficking, rather than the organized criminal mafias. But now the question is, are the guerrillas now the organized criminal mafias that have taken over? And if you talk about the Zetas and you talk about the others in Mexico, eventually these can have a political agenda not only related to drug trafficking and the ability to move drugs across and make money, but also to begin to be involved in the political system. And we've seen some of that already happen.
Alfredo, you want to respond to
I think, in the U.S. side, other than the Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders, I don't know of any government agency or efforts to help reporters along the border. In Mexico, I know that the PGR started, it was a small, and I forget the name, I apologize, it's a small unit to protect, ¿cómo se llama?
Fiscal Especial.
Fiscal Especial, to protect journalists. A couple of years ago, a colleague of mine and myself, we received a threat in Mexico City, and we went to visit them, and it was very encouraging because they were very prompt. They call us immediately. We want to talk to you. But it was interesting when it was also embarrassing because they were so attentive. And when we said, well, there's a lot of Mexican journalists that we know, we have names, we have phone numbers, cell phones, who also are under threat, and we'd like to give you and they were very, sí, pero están metidos in, they're involved, they're influenced, and that was discouraging. To the point that we stopped going because again, as American journalists, you can parachute in, parachute out. It's not. It's a big advantage. When during the Chabat ceremonies in New York, there were some Latin American journalists who I thought had a really good idea, and that's to try to bring in journalists from Colombia and other Latin American countries who have gone through this and maybe have them play a role in bridging the gap, because there's a lot of jealousies, petty jealousies among Mexican journalists in Mexico, a lot of bad blood. Everybody wants to kind of take the lead, and so the idea is maybe have the Latin American journalists come in, bridge the gap between the Mexican journalists, and then also have U.S. journalists who cover the border, cover Mexico, and try to either build an organization or bring awareness. And that's something that Andrew Seeley and I will talk about later today. Thank you.
Any more questions? I have one. This is far from my field. As those of you who know me, I'm an economist. And this is a topic that I just watch and listen to. But it seems to me that if you cannot fight this with increasing the benefits, but only by increasing the cost, one of the cost can be increased on the U.S. side also. And it always puzzles me that not enough, I don't hear enough of it. How much is done in the U.S. to prevent the drug from being distributed? Because, maybe it crosses the border, but how does it get to every single person that consumes it here? You don't have the same problem in the U.S. as in Mexico because the extent of corruption is smaller. Even, I'm sure it exists, but it's much smaller. You don't need to resort to the military to do this. You have a much more robust judicial and policing system. So why can't the cost be increased on this side?
For me?
Yeah.
I'm not American. So
Peter and
don't look at me.
And John are happy to.
Let me just say one quick thing. The U.S. spends enormous amounts of money on trying to prevent drug trafficking in this country. Our jails are absolutely filled. This is why we have, I think, the second largest rate of incarceration in the world is drug criminals.
But it's not enough.
I'm just saying, but the cost is enormous, and all the jails are overflowing. In fact, there was just a decision made to allow people who there used to be a very great disparity in sentencing between people with small amounts of crack cocaine compared to powder cocaine. And there's now it was, they allow judges now to assign the same sentences rather than much more. There's a big racial difference between the users of crack. And it turns out now there are huge political battles on what about those that were in jail for long periods. And why? Because they say they don't want to let them out of jail because these are often very dangerous people. The point is that a huge amount I think 90% of all U.S. anti-drug money is spent in the United States.
No, I don't doubt that.
So, in other words, there's just a huge, and the cost is enormous. Every police department, every school system spends enormous amounts. It's just very hard. Well, I was going to say one thing. You ask any big city mayor or any big city police chief, and they say, go fight the drugs overseas. We're overwhelmed here. We can't do anything. You talk about anybody who works overseas with drugs. We can't do anything here. You've got to fight demand. It's a mess.
So you can,
But one of the things that we see on the Mexican side, and this is, again, I'm not a government spokesman, so I don't, but people see in Mexico, is that there's very little apparently being done against the organized criminal part of this in the United States. Well, you don't see it. You don't hear about it. I can talk about a year has gone by. I have not seen a major drug trafficker or drug trafficking organization being.
Just look at New York City yesterday.
There were two hands here. Do you want to respond to
Those are not the organized.
I was just going to add to what Peter said. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to make that big. That in addition to what huge amount of money we're spending on enforcement in this country, one of the issues that Chairman Engel brought up yesterday is we're actually decreasing the amount of money we're spending on drug consumption or prevention program demand reduction, which to me is the bigger. I mean, the amount we're spending on building jails and incarcerating our own people is outrageous, but we're also spending less money on prevention and demand reduction. And the panelists had no real explanation other than we're in war in Iraq and we all have to take a hit. But it's tragic.
Though he doesn't want to introduce himself, that's Eric Olson, who is writing a very interesting report on, I'm kidding you, Eric. He's writing a very interesting report on the Merida Initiative that asks some of these questions, actually, whether it's a cooperative agreement. We'll make sure all of you who are interested get a copy, keep in touch with us. It's 2 or 3 months down the road, but I think we'll ask some of these questions of what should be in the U.S.-Mexico cooperation agreement.
No, I've got another question, not to...
I don't know if John wants to
Well,
respond.
Nora stirred things up. I don't want to step into it because she's got a fight going here. But Peter's point's well taken. That if you include incarceration as a prevention policy in the United States, I'm surprised we're second with the incarceration rate. We're first, I thought, with respect to industrialized countries, and some large percentage of our inmates in federal and state and local prisons are there for drug issues. The question's a good one, and when we read congressional testimony from the Drug Enforcement Administration, the answer typically is that the distribution's done through immigrant communities. And so I've read that any number of times. I have no idea whether it's, I mean, I assume they know what they're talking about and that this is a finding of theirs. And I assume that in my own mind, the equation of evasion, corruption, and confrontation, it leans more toward evasion and corruption. And certainly corruption's been a problem in the United States, and we've found issues on our own border control agents. So I simply put it over to the combination of evasion and corruption, which allows... It's an interesting question. What is the consumption, what quantity of drugs are required to satisfy the U.S. market? I would just hazard a wild guess it could be met by 3 tractor-trailers of drugs that come into the country. I mean, it strikes me that somebody knows this more than I do. but it's hard to detect and to stop it in terms of the interdiction along the border. So where I was going with that is the evasion part is fairly easy to take care of. And then if the testimony of the drug enforcement people is correct, the immigrant communities, which is the ones that they point to, are those that handle the wholesaling, and then it transfers over to a whole variety of groups with respect to the retailing. I'm simply passing on to you what I read in the congressional reports.
Okay. Yes.
May I? Jay Cope from the National Defense University. One of the lessons that I think we can take from the Colombian experience is in working with our Congress is going to want to see some kind of a national security strategy on the part of Mexico that is the basis for which we are supporting with these different programs. This was satisfied by the Uribe administration with their democratic security and defense policy, which actually has proven to be very successful. Is there something on the Mexican side that helps us plug these particular programs into some kind of a context so that we know, or actually it's not only the supplemental, but it's the next two tranches as well, so that we know exactly what Mexico is trying to do? There has been absolutely no discussion of this. Personal contact suggests that there was a great deal of pressure by the State Department on Mexico to develop something so that they had some basis to be able to argue in support of what they're. Does anybody know anything about this? Because it certainly is not terribly visible. And second question, I'd like to just press Andres a little bit. What would be the metrics for a Mexican decision to take this arrangement off the table? Has there been any serious thought as to what that is, which I think would be absolutely disastrous for our relationship, and not to mention the relationship with Mexico and other countries in the region? But how serious is this thought?
Andres, you want to?
I'm just here to learn.
You're learning fast.
Well, on the first question, Jay, I think I think Medina Mora and Genaro Garcia Luna have been up here more than any other previous attorney generals or public safety, public security secretaries in history. I mean, it seems to me rather strange that I hear from you that you don't know. I mean, they've been in this room. They've been all over the place for the last year talking about a strategy relating to what it is that the Calderon administration wants to do. And I'm not the one to tell you what it is, but I think that they certainly have been here and they've made that point very, very clearly. And I think they've made the point to the U.S. administration and they've made the point to Congress, because they have, on each of these visits, have been talking to all of these players. So, whether or not it succeeds, as Jorge says, is an open question, just like whether or not the war in Iraq succeeds. Everybody knows there's a strategy, but, whether it's going to, at the end of the day, be a winning strategy, who knows? And I think that the Mexican administration, this current administration, certainly has a strategy. It's a cornerstone of its domestic policy and has now become a cornerstone of its foreign policy as well. On the second question of what would it take to have, Mexico throw the towel in and say, it's not worth the cost, is also a difficult question to answer. I think it'll be a question of how much domestic politics in the U.S. Get a hold of this issue, how much, Mr. McCain feels it necessary to move away from his more traditional moderate positions on these issues and use it to gather support from the very right wing and conservative wing of his party, and what the Democratic candidates play around with. That's one issue. I think in Congress, the human rights issue will be probably something that could eventually, irritate Mexico sufficiently if it is couched in the terms that it often is in this country. And there again, the U.S. has lost a great deal of credibility, not only in Mexico, but around the world on issues of human rights. So, who judges the judge, basically, is where you are. But, I'm not forecasting that this will happen. I just think that it is an issue which has already been put on the table by at least one member of Calderon's cabinet, saying if the cost is too high, we are not going to pursue the initiative.
You want to respond to?
Just very briefly, this is not for me to say, but no, there is a strategy. I think it's probably one of the most clear strategies any government has had against organized crime. And from my point of view, is I think I mentioned that is to attack the structure of the cartels and pulverize them. For me, that's a strategy. It can work. It has worked in other places, and become a country with a lot of small criminal organizations like you in the United States. We want to be like you. No, we won't have these big cartels that every man.
Oligopoly to a competitive market.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right. Well, she's an economist.
That's what you understand.
Yeah, exactly. So you won't have these big cartels with these big levels of violence. And at the same time, it will be easier to deal with international pressure, because now everybody knows what are the big cartels, 3 or 4. We more or less know what are the leaders of that. But when you have 50 cartels, forget it. That's impossible. Nobody will know who's the leader, and nobody will care who's the leader. Mm-hmm. And, well, it doesn't mean the solution of the problem. No, maybe the ideal solution for Mexico, not for the world, is what the former Attorney General Jorge Madrazo said in 1999, that the goal of at that time, still in the border operation, that the goal of that strategy was to push the drug traffickers in order they move to other territories, that means to other countries, which probably was well received by Central America and Caribbean countries. Oh, thank you guys, you're going to send us their drug traffickers. Well, that's another way to solve the problem. No? I don't think it's possible because of the geographical proximity, but, well, could be, and send them all to the Caribbean and Cuba and all these countries. But in the short term, I think the strategy is that. To make them smaller with lower levels of violence, and at some point to have an efficient police that can deal with drug trafficking like other crimes, like killings or auto parts, stealing, whatever. So I don't think the best strategy will be to disappear drug trafficking. It's not going to happen. It's not happening here. It's not happening anywhere. I don't know if it's going to be successful, but at this point, I insist. What we saw in the last month is an attack of the Calderon administration to the government, to this level, not to the big leaguers, well, to big leaguers too, but to this level. And the government has been capturing a lot of Zetas, a lot of these sicarios, this guy. So that can have an effect in the middle run. Obviously, we will have violence during the following months as an answer response of this government to the government. But this strategy can be successful in that sense. And I think you have to choose between having drug trafficking with violence and big cartels and drug traffickers without this amount of violence and smaller cartels. Well, I think the second option is the least bad option. That's all. You cannot aspire to more than that.
Can I say one thing quickly?
Sure.
I was just going to add that the other option for drug traffickers is not to move to other places, but to multitask and move into other forms of crime, and that's why the United States has these multiple goals, and amongst those goals is improving public security and justice administration. But I suspect that's the lesser goal as to interdicting trafficking. And if the trafficking moves in some important way out of the routes that it's in now, it may satisfy the U.S. interest, and then there would be a decline. But for Mexico, there's a new equilibrium, and it's just as Ambassador Rosenthal was mentioning, the internal drug market has grown some, I don't know how much, but it's grown substantially. And what we've seen with trafficking militias, when the trafficking is no longer the profitable option, they'll go into kidnapping and extortion and armed robbery. And so it's not the old equilibrium. It's a new kind of equilibrium, and it's one in which public safety it remains a serious problem, and in some ways perhaps a more serious problem.
Okay, yes, over there.
Mauricio Guerra from the Mexican Embassy. Just to answer a little bit of the seriousness of the commitment of President Calderon, I think it's clear that the commitment is there, and I think he has backed up what he has been saying with actions. I think there's a clear path of what the government would like to do, and it's working in different fronts. In Mexico, cooperation internationally with the U.S., with other countries, and also proposing a judicial reform in Mexico. So I think this is really, the president knows where he wants to take the country. We need to combat these criminal organizations that have become strong. And the message we want to send with what we propose to the United States is that we share the responsibility in combating this problem. It affects both countries, and that we really need to work together if we want to be successful. Thank you.
Okay, yes, we're here, and this is the last question.
Okay. Enrique Bravo, Eureka Group. Thanks. Just a quick question, perhaps mostly for John and Jorge. Previously, cartels did not really require to have a clear and explicit political agenda. They could coexist with the government as long as they could guarantee some levels of protection. If the fight becomes more frontal, do you think, or do you see already some movement towards, having a more or a clearer political agenda, trying to infiltrate not only, law enforcement agencies, but the actual way of how politics are carried out, particularly at the state and local level? We already saw some of that in Michoacán and Tamaulipas in the 2007 election. So that's a little bit, I don't know if John spoke about it earlier. I apologize if you did, because I came in late. But do you see something along those lines? I mean, the cartels have enough financial capacity now to, promote candidates and to do that particularly at the local and the state level. So how do you see that moving in the future?
Do you mean partisan, or that is that maybe an agenda, that it's an ideological agenda, or?
No, I mean like supporting explicitly candidates, and they've done that across the board, not only with specific parties. I mean, they've done that with different parties, but.
Yeah. Oh yeah, of course.
I see.
They don't have ideological preferences.
Well, I was just going to say, my impression is just as you've said, it's opportunism that the groups will finance what they think at the local level and at the state level is useful, and make calculations like other interest groups, and place money where they think it can do the most good without much of a partisan agenda. I think very interesting, it's already been raised about a political agenda, is what Alfredo had mentioned and others have mentioned, which is the infiltration of social movements. And to the extent that the example that Alfredo gave was a drug group that could give money to a human rights group, or a drug group that could give money to some kind of a social protest movement. And that's really very difficult and very, very complicated. So on the partisan side, it seems to me opportunistic, but what's more complicated would be, to me, on the sort of interest group and social movement side. And I think there is an agenda that's already beginning to appear. And that's to complicate the efforts of the police and the army.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that. Yeah, well, this has been a very old discussion of if drug trafficking wants to take over the state. My impression is that they don't need to do that. Actually, it's counterproductive to do that. I mean, the ideal situation for sometimes drug trafficking is not very rational, but the ideal situation for drug trafficking is to have a discreetly corrupt state. Discreetly. If you put, this Ociel Cárdenas as president of, it won't work. I mean, forget it. It's not going to work. If you put a drug trafficker as a candidate it's not going to work. No. The most useful thing is that you have some people in the government that work with you, but nobody knows that, because if somebody knows, if you are very open, it doesn't work. No. I agree with John that the corruption is there at the local level. Yeah, I mean, in my impression is it has moved from the federal level to the local level, because they don't need to buy the president of the country to work. Actually, I insist it's counterproductive. If everybody suspects that the president of Mexico is involved in drug trafficking, my God, you will have the Marines there, fighting the drug traffickers. So, but at the local level, they don't need even to buy, governors. They just need to buy the local chief of police or the guy who's in charge of controlling the business. They don't need more than that. And I insist, it's counterproductive. Higher levels of corruption, open levels of corruption are counterproductive for drug trafficking. Like higher levels of violence are counterproductive. This is what I call the irrational tendencies of drug trafficking. Sometimes they are not very rational. Sometimes, like this spiral of violence we have seen, that it has been counterproductive it has been bad for business. And this is that they have realized that. Just to finish my comment, there is a story that appeared in Proceso some months ago about the supposed pact among drug traffickers around May in order to diminish the levels of violence. And the story quotes a supposed drug trafficker from Sinaloa, the Sinaloa cartel, who arrived to that meeting and said, "Come on, blood and business are not a good combination. We are drug traffickers, not assassins." Oh, well, okay, good to know that. But in the end, there is something rational there. I mean, drug trafficking needs some violence, needs some corruption to work, because it's part of the business. But when you surpass some functional limits, this is bad for business. And my impression that high and open corruption is bad for business. It doesn't mean that this is not going to happen, but they don't want a state. They don't need a state. I mean, they want to make business, and they are businessmen basically. So. But well, that's my.
If I can just add something quickly, I mean, my experience is that they're very pragmatic, they're very sophisticated, and they're very local. I mean, as Jorge was saying, the very first thing they do when they take over a community is they target the police department, then the local mayor's office, and then the local press. I mean, that's how they control, and they're very sophisticated in the way they operate. I mean, it's almost like a regular company, Not long ago, I was having lunch with this guy, very sophisticated. We were talking about the situation along the border and this and that. And as I left, there was a source of mine who said, what were you talking to this guy about? And I said, and he said, that's the money man for the golf cartel, and his job is to target, specific key organizations and help, co-opt them. Mm-hmm. I would have never thought that, because you think of, as Jorge was saying, a bunch of thugs, a bunch of hitmen, but they're very, very savvy businessmen.
Oh, yeah.
On that note, we can declare the meeting finished. And, let's give a hand to the